Well, hello to our community group leaders and participants. This is the teaching series extra for Sunday, June 24th, 2018. And we're studying this week. In fact, I just finished the message, writing it this morning. It's on 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 1 through 6. And basically, Peter says, you spend enough time wasting your life living aimless, pointless lives. You now have a brand new destiny. You're called to glorify God. You're called to become like Jesus Christ. You're called into Christ likeness. But what he addresses in the first part of chapter 4 of 1 Peter is the two things that want to pull us back to that old way of living, those two things that produce this drag on our becoming like Christ. One is other people. There's peer pressure even for adults. But really what creates the biggest drag on our relationship with Christ is ourselves. And so I'm going to be using this in the course of the message and want to talk through it a little bit on this video, because if I were teaching this in my community group, what I would do is I would focus in on this. So thinking in terms of it is ourselves, it is me that creates the most drag in my relationship with Christ. The most resistance is from myself. I reference a work by an 8th century monk. His name is Father Maximus of Mount Athos. That is a mouthful. But what he does, and I think he does this in a very simple, ingenious way, is he walks through the steps of temptation. Here's how temptation comes to play in our lives. First thing he says is that temptation attacks. Now, everyone, no matter how spiritual, is attacked by temptation. No one is ever above temptation. No one ever escapes temptation. We need to expect it and anticipate it, okay? If even Jesus was tempted, we will be tempted, okay? So that first step is really outside of our control, okay? Temptation will attack. But then the next three things are within our control. The next step is conversation. We start talking really to that temptation. We start in this bit of negotiation. So I see this in the Garden of Eden when Satan tempts Eve, okay? He's pounced to attack, okay? Sin is coiled at the door of her mind. And he said, did God really say not to eat this fruit? And of course, Eve starts in this conversation. If we start conversing with temptation, it's going to convince us. It's just a matter of time. All right, so really the best thing we can do with temptation is just say, no, I'm not going there. But we all tend to kind of get into this negotiation. We get into this conversation with sin, and then we consent. That's the next step. We go from attack to conversation to consent. We decide, okay, I'll try this just a little bit, just once, and we open the door. We give permission for sin to go from the outside to the inside of our lives. Then it moves from conversation to consent to captivity. When we decide we don't want to do this anymore, it is increasingly difficult, because once we've compromised once, it's easier to do in the future, and on and on and on, and pretty soon we are held captive by our own desires. So there's one more step. I want to stop here for just a moment. That first step of temptation, the attack, is outside of our control. The next three are things that we willingly do: conversation, consent, captivity. The last step, like the first, is when we have lost all control. And I would phrase this last stage addiction. We're all addicted to some sin. We all have lost that ability to say no, and only by God's grace and His Holy Spirit empowering our lives can we get our lives out of that. And it takes God's Spirit, it takes authenticity of confession, it takes the accountability of others. So the reason I want to give you a heads up on this is because I think these 5 steps are very, very accurate. Attack, conversation, consent, captivity, and addiction. What I would encourage you to do in your community groups is talk through this. How does this play out? Take a particular sin or a particular temptation and kind of play that out. Now, I want to caution you about oversharing and allowing people to share too much and get too personal. But I think there are sins that we all deal with that we see this trend, okay? And if I could end on a point, I would encourage you to tell people, hey, the best thing we can do when we're attacked is we say no. We don't get drawn into that conversation. We're not baited into going in a direction that we know is opposite of God, what God would want from us. And we say no to that temptation and move on with our lives. Again, it's ourselves, we create the greatest drag in our relationship with Christ. Sorry, I just ate some almonds and probably shouldn't do that right before shooting a video. It's ourselves that create the greatest drag in our relationship with Christ. And imagine what it would be like if you became your greatest ally in becoming like Jesus. May the Lord bless you this week. May you continue to become like Christ. And as always, I'm proud to be your pastor. God bless you.